I'll provide some introductory materials while folks roll in. So good afternoon. Thank you for joining this Foretell in Conversation webinar. My name is Michael Page. I'm a CSET research fellow and the lead investigator of Foretell, a crowd forecasting project at Georgetown's CSET. Foretell's forecasts are publicly accessible at cset-foretell.com. While you don't need to be a registered forecaster to use the site, registered forecasters have access to more information. I encourage everyone here to join the community. A couple quick housekeeping notes. All attendees' microphones are muted. If you have a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll reserve the last 15 or 20 minutes for questions. So our featured guest today is Professor Michael Horowitz. Mike is political science professor, director of Perry Worldhouse, and Richard Perry Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He previously worked for the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Department of Defense, and is affiliated with the Center for New American Security, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He's also the lead author of a white paper published in February of this year titled Keeping Score, a New Approach to Geopolitical Forecasting, which does a deep dive into the US government's use of forecasting tools over the past decade, explores why they've not gotten as much traction as perhaps they could have, and recommends a path forward. And I'd love to talk about that paper today. Mike, thanks for joining us. I'm thrilled to discuss this topic. Preliminary question, how did you get involved in geopolitical forecasting?
I mean, honestly, the reason is totally idiosyncratic. I was Phil Tetlock and Barb Mellers, who are two, obviously have done a lot of research on geopolitical forecasting, had just arrived at the University of Pennsylvania from Berkeley, I believe. And Phil and I happened to be at a dinner together and ended up sharing a cab, back to Center City, Philadelphia from wherever we were. And in the cab ride, he either, conned me or persuaded me to get involved with what was then a nascent project that became the Good Judgment Project as part of some US government intelligence community efforts to try to understand geopolitical forecasting methods a little bit in more detail. So I don't know, if not for a cab ride with Phil Tetlock, who knows whether I would be here. But it was a topic that was always, in some ways, in retrospect, it makes sense that I got involved in this, given that I would run the political science department NCAA pool every year. We created over/under leagues in the department for varieties of things. I've always kind of thought that probabilistic approaches to understanding the world were interesting, and this was a way to bring together that interest in some ways that had been in my personal life as much as anything, with my professional interest in international relations and international security.
Fantastic. And you do wear an unusual combination of hats, with one foot in academia and one foot in government. I imagine that's informed your take on this question, which also relates to your paper. So let's get into the paper. In the off chance anyone listening hasn't read it, can you provide a summary?
Sure. I mean, so what Keeping Score does is it goes through nascent efforts that started during the George W. Bush administration, and then during the picked up during the Obama administration, focused on how to improve the US government's geopolitical forecasting capacity. The idea was to use quantitative approaches like the wisdom of crowds and prediction markets and statistical models to try to complement existing approaches, scenario planning, war games, qualitative assessments by analysts, et cetera. And a lot of these proved, I think, very successful from a scientific perspective in demonstrating the ability of crowdsourced methods in particular, but others as well, to deliver improvements in our ability to forecast geopolitical events, especially narrowly tailored events over a couple weeks to 2 years kind of time frame. And this generated some excitement both inside and outside the government. But then over the last couple of years, all those efforts kind of fell apart. And many of the R&D efforts ended. Efforts to transition some of the R&D into programs didn't quite pan out. And we really wanted to understand why. What happened? Like the science looked good, And if you look at the popularity of somebody, I don't know, somebody like Nate Silver or something, there's broad popular interest in some these kinds of approaches. So we wanted to try to get a sense about what happened and then how to move things forward, with the idea that with the Biden administration now in power, that there might be an opportunity to try to make the case for why a renewed focus on probabilistic forecasting is not just like a scientifically interesting thing, but something that would actually improve the capacity of the US government to understand what's going on in the world and more effectively design policies. So the report goes through some of that history. It describes what happened, some of the bureaucratic resistance to some of these efforts, and then lays out some conceptual paths forward for what a version 2.0 of this kind of initiative could actually look like.
The report draws a parallel between a similar effort in the 1970s, I believe, to use quantification within the US government, within, I think, DoD specifically. To what extent is the challenge that you're seeing with geopolitical forecasting like unique versus an example of a broader pattern of the US government being slow to incorporate like useful tools in its processes?
Well, I would say I might separate this into a couple of different categories. I think one is, if you think of, my background is much more in the defense world, sort of military innovation world. If you think about the infamous valley of death when it comes to acquisition, where R&D programs, even if very promising, often don't end up transitioning into programs of record that the military services end up procuring. So there's a bit of it that I think is just the natural challenge of taking R&D has to hit at the right time with the right momentum to, with the right potential end user to want to adopt it. So, in that way, the sort of story we're telling in the report is, you could probably tell about dozens of things, to the point of your question. But I think there's another element here that these methods were, I think, perceived as, rightly or wrongly, pretty disruptive to how the US government had thought about forecasting in the past. The shift to quantifying probabilities, not just saying, this might happen, this could happen, or using something like words of estimated probability, that this is, somewhat likely, somewhat unlikely, but no, that's 75%, that's 65%. It enables keeping score in a way that I think there's a lot of support for in the government, but also some opposition to, for all the kinds of reasons that you could imagine. And so when this is I think it's a classic bureaucratic politics story, when the bureaucratic champions of some of these types of methods ended up leaving the US government for different kinds of reasons, then these efforts have sort of fallen apart. I mean, that's what happened in the 1970s. And I think that in some ways that's what happened a couple of years ago. And it was fascinating doing the research for this, finding a memo from Andy Marshall to Henry Kissinger about, trying to quantify probabilities of geopolitical events. And Kissinger, they're two legends, Kissinger and Marshall, going back and forth, essentially, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had betting odds about the probability of the Soviet Union to do this, that, or the other thing? And then 50 years later, we're in the exact same place.
So I want to understand why, but before I ask why it hasn't gotten more traction, I think it's useful to understand the practical benefits of this tool. The paper, so there are many possible reasons that using quantitative forecasting can be useful, and I wonder whether the most salient reasons are often kind of lost in a sea of possible reasons. So what do you think are the one or two most salient benefits of using quantitative forecasting in government decision processes?
Sure, I think there. I would call out. Let me call out three relatively briefly that advantages of quantification. I think the first is that it decreases conceptual confusion. If you tell somebody that something is somewhat likely, somewhat unlikely, et cetera, there's experimental research that shows that people will sometimes have actually dramatic disagreements about what that means. Some people might say somewhat likely means there's a 40% chance of something happening. Some people might think saying something is somewhat likely that means there's a 70% chance that will happen. That's a huge delta, right? Like 30% on the probability spectrum. And using quantification, saying actually the probability is 55% or something like that, helps make sure that everybody's on the same page in a policymaking process when it comes to an assessment from whatever the sort of group or agency or something is about the probability that something will happen. And getting everyone on the same page seems likely to generate better decisions. So that's the first reason.
Mm-hmm.
I think the second reason is actually a training reason that we know from a variety of academic research that we're all subject to cognitive biases that shape the way that we view the world, the way that we think about probability, that and likelihoods of things happening. Kind of like how people often go back to the same analogies over and over again to try to assess what whether something's likely to happen, et cetera. And I think quantification, by providing feedback on whether your guesses were correct, in combination with sort of training on cognitive debiasing, can help everybody get better at assessment in general and in understanding the world in general, which would likely, I think, lead to a better policymaking process. The third reason why I think quantification can have advantages is that it generates accountability. That you want to know in some ways if you're supposed to be forecasting about what what China's likely to do, what Russia's likely to do, sort of something like that, then being forced to quantify that assessment and then we find out essentially if it's right or wrong, that provides a form of accountability. And that, just to be clear, the point here is not that that's like the only way that you would do things, the only way that people should be assessed or something like that. But as a complement to existing approaches, it provides, I think, a new perspective on how to think about accuracy, and could actually potentially reveal a lot of talent out there at something, forecasting, that's actually really important for the US government to get right.
Right. So obviously, if you change the way you evaluate people, there are going to be winners and losers. And so it's not surprising that this would be unsettling to some. But I want to understand why the policy world is so different from the finance world. So in the finance world, traders are evaluated based upon their track record, which is effectively their forecasting skill. Ultimately, finance and policymaking are engaged in similar endeavors. They're modeling a complex environment. They're anticipating how it will change over time, and they're using that information to try to inform their decisions. It would be unthinkable for traders not to be evaluated based upon how well they've performed. Why isn't that just like the obvious way to evaluate people who are trying to make good decisions in a government context?
That's a really good question. So I think, obviously broadly, I think that, these methods, in complementing existing methods, have a lot of upside for how the government, how we do geopolitical forecasting. But I think that there are some differences in how we think about the geopolitical world or the national security world compared to how we think about how the finance world sort of views itself and evaluates itself and sort of acts on a daily basis. That explain some of those differences. Whether one agrees with it or not, then is a different question. So in the finance world, you can have millions or billions of trades, depending on how automated, what kinds of bots we're talking about, how automated, what sort of volume you're talking about, every day. And at the end of the day, success is pretty easily measurable, right? Like either your trades make money or they don't make money over whatever sort of time frame an institution or your boss or something like that, decides are relevant. So essentially the performance indicators, the terminal performance indicators for the job, pretty easy to assess. And now there could always be extenuating, like you could lose money, but there could be extenuating circumstances but you still might be a great trader, whatever. But at the end of the day, the performance measures that we have are generally agreed upon, and it's basically did you make money?
Right.
What does that mean in the national security world? I had a friend who, very dear friend, who left the national security world after many years, and started, left DC, started a really successful business, and she was kind of on her way out. We were getting coffee or something, and chatting about why she was leaving DC and in the national security world. She said, "Well, I felt like all I was doing at the end of the day was trying to prevent bad things from happening. And I want to go build something. Like, I think that's fun. And like, cool, whatever on the business side. But I think that point about the national security world and, really stuck with me, obviously, since I just said it. And that the idea there that when we think about, who is effective, or who has good judgment from a national security perspective, we tend to draw on an extremely small number of instances over the course of somebody's career or over the course of somebody's tenure, and use those to evaluate them. And often those are activities, or those are incidents that I would say in a nerdy academic way are off the equilibrium path potentially.
Mhm.
You might say in a more policy friendly way that there were sort of low probability, high impact things that popped and either turned into a disaster, in which case we think like, hey, somebody did a terrible job, like, or the US muddled through and figured it out, and then we think like somebody did a great job.
Right.
And so we don't have like because it's these signature events that are don't happen necessarily all that often, that are generally how we think about like who's successful or not in the national security world, especially as you go like sort of up the bureaucratic food chain. Then it's like what it means to succeed or fail, sort of how we measure that is a little less clear. And so then these methods don't naturally translate in the same way that they might seem to naturally translate in the finance world, even if they would be even if they would be a good idea, which in some ways is saying that regardless of whether one buys like my bit or like our bit or whatever about geopolitical forecasting. By the way, side note, everybody sign up for Foretell. Please do it right now if you haven't done it already. Sign up for Foretell.
Yeah,
But
I'm
even if you
now, Mike.
but even if you don't buy the bit on that, how we think about who succeeds in the national security world and what success means, if we could do that a little more systematically, in some ways taking account the non-events, like the crises that didn't happen, that somebody's work maybe helped prevent, or like all the times that they got stuff right, not just focusing on like a big intelligence failure or something like that, that would give us a more well-rounded impression of both how the intelligence community is doing and how our national security community is doing.
Well, obviously what the outcome measures should be and policy are going to be very contested. A concern I have is that people don't want to make the goals explicit because it's too messy and they'll disagree. But their policies are still vaguely aimed at some goal. And so my guess is the outcome is worse by everyone's lights if people don't attempt to make the things they're trying to achieve explicit. In other words, it's a version of the sausage problem, where you don't really want to know how the sausage is made. It's too messy, and so you just kind of ignore that and assume that everyone will be like more comfortable without the ingredients being made explicit. Do you think like the concern about like arguing over what the actual goals are, how to actually articulate a question of interest, is one of the obstacles to using explicit forecasting tools in this context?
I think a little, yeah, actually, I mean, I think a little bit. I think what it reflects more is that there are political incentives, like, and I don't necessarily mean like partisan incentives here. I mean like job incentives, bureaucratic organizational incentives, in which, to be clear, makes sense. People respond to the incentives you give them. To, I think, be a little careful in how things are described, how they're assessed, like what the goals of say what the and with the goals of a policy, our classification, I think, also impacts this. Like, say you might have a policy action that in public you say one thing about why this policy is happening, and so in the outside world, success is judged based on that explicit criteria, the criteria that you gave. Yeah. Whereas internally, it might be two other things that are actually really what you were going for, but for reasons that have to do with secrecy, you're not gonna reveal, and people don't see those. And so thus it makes some of that assessment a little bit difficult. I would say that and that's an inherent, that's a signaling kind of issue that's inherently difficult to resolve. It's also true when you're trying to design policy to shape multiple actors' perspectives. This was always an issue with the old quadrennial defense review in the Department of Defense, and that the quadrennial defense review needed to signal to Congress that the US needed more money. It needed to signal to adversaries that the US the US military was able to fight and was able to fight and win the nation's wars, and it needed to signal to allies and partners that the US was in good shape, but also needed their help. And that's three different messages basically that you're trying to send with one document, and that's incredibly challenging, and you see that in the policymaking process kind of all the time. I do think that putting aside that kind of success notion and focusing on process, I do think that the more explicit people can be, I don't necessarily mean numerically, but the more explicit people can be about why they think the things that they think, what is your underlying understanding of the world that you think North Korea will respond this way to something as opposed to that way. Right. Why is that? Is it because of your understanding of past cases involving North Korea? Is it because of your understanding of past cases involving nuclear weapon states? Is it because of your understanding of this, that, or the other thing? That essentially, what's the base? What's creating, to be more forecasting-y about it, the base rate that then is informing your sort of policy recommendation or instinct about what's going to happen in the world. The more explicit we can be about our assumptions and what drives our understanding of the world and assessment of a particular policy case, the more we can figure out, I think, even in a complicated bureaucratic situation where you have sort of multiple people that are disagreeing with each other in good faith, it helps you get to this question of why they disagree with each other. And I think when you actually get to that authentic why, it makes it easier, more likely that you're going to assess things in the best possible way, which will help you then get to better policy outcomes.
You talk about falsifiability a lot in the paper, and I just want to focus on that specifically, because I imagine that one of the reservations people have about using these methods is you really put yourself out there. If I say, I think there's a 50% chance that this specific thing will happen, and you will know in 6 months whether it did or did not, I make myself vulnerable to being shown to be wrong. Clearly, the entire apparatus would benefit if people were clear about what they thought would happen, but they might be doing at a cost to themselves individually. How do we bridge that gap between kind of the collective interest and falsifiability and the individual liabilities one takes on by saying something that could turn out to be wrong?
Well, I think it's a great question. I think there are 4 things you can do. One is, as I mentioned before, I think, if you had a really effective, forecasting platform, say within a part of the U.S. government, that's not the only way that you're evaluating people. And you don't even need to necessarily use it to evaluate people. The idea is to use it for the aggregate, not necessarily you could use it in the aggregate, not use it necessarily to judge an individual. I think that's actually a totally plausible way to move forward that might address the concerns that some might have, while also generating the sort of aggregated information that might help improve forecasting. So that's one thing.
Yep.
I think a second thing is how we think about who's a good forecaster, and that you can have leaderboards. Obviously, you can have a big, imagine there's a big board or something, and it just lists everybody, and so then you're scared to forecast because you don't want to fall down the list potentially. Now, there also could be upside if you get to the top of the list, but one way to do that is to change what leaderboards look like, to not have like a big board with everybody forecasting and like how they're ranked against each other, but do it within offices or within teams, or to make some of that private, except for end users that are aggregating things. That it doesn't just need to be that it's not necessarily the case that like everybody would see whether you got something right or wrong, or you could have a leaderboard reset every couple of months or something like that. I think that there are options essentially to the way that you present accuracy information beyond the, you want to know what your own accuracy information is, because that's part of how you get feedback to get better. But there's a lot of options for how you present that information more broadly that I think could mitigate or even resolve sort of some of those concerns. Then I think the third thing is this gets back to what I mentioned before about how often in the national security world, we evaluate whether someone is successful or not based on what is an incredibly tiny number of the decisions and judgments that they make throughout their career, based on one crisis out of 1,000 different sort of calls that they made. And by regularizing the notion of forecasting, it decreases the impact in some ways of any given particular forecast as like illustrative of like you and like your judgment sort of out there in the world. Since sure, like everybody's going to get calls wrong, for the right reasons, for the wrong reasons, et cetera. But if what we're talking about is it's not just that like one call that somehow somebody's looking at, but you could, but 100 calls, 1,000 calls, sort of, et cetera, then that I think decreases the importance of any one of them and makes it easier to be able to participate. And the last thing I would add is I do think that the upside proposition here is if you think that you're really smart and understand things about the world, then this is a way to illustrate that. And while at the same time improving the capacity of if something like this existed in a government, improving the capacity of the government to see the future.
Where would you begin? What's the low-hanging fruit context in the U.S. government where you think forecasting tools can be most useful, most quickly, with the least overhaul of cultural conventions?
I mean, I think there are a lot of locations in the government where you could put a forecasting platform. And now part of this depends on like how classified you would want it to be. There depends on the kind of questions that you want to ask. But I think you've got a couple of different options essentially. And part of where something landed might depend a bit on who your bureaucratic champions sort of end up being. If you think about, to be explicit about how what I think some of the underlying bureaucratic processes can look like sometimes. So the most logical place to put this kind of initiative would be within the U.S. intelligence community, probably within ODNI or something like that, since that's an office that explicitly cares about assessing the direction that the world is likely to head in, and this provides an additional tool in the toolkit to help them do that, which I think offers then, and so that is and they. Which I think offers an opportunity to put it in the most sort of like natural place that you could do it. You could imagine very specific homes, even within the intelligence community, like if you were going to say you had an unclassified platform in varieties of open source intelligence offices, could be a good location for one of these kinds of endeavors. Moving out of the intelligence community, someplace in USDI. In defense intelligence, certainly would be a place that these sort of things could land, or within the executive branch, or within the if you suppose you wanted to forecast not just about national security questions, but about other kinds of questions, you could imagine institutions like OMB that where you could have possibilities. But I think that there are multiple possible ways to get to a win here of improving our capacity to forecast. It's just a question of where you want to start.
So you talk in the report about whether you should actually require, or whether whomever's in charge should require people to use quantitative forecasts in their intelligence reports or assessments. Can you say a bit more about how you think that should or could work in practice?
Sure. So imagine a case where you had a forecasting question that asked, suppose the question is, what's the probability that China is going to, invade Taiwan over the next year? Say, like, that's the question that you're worried about. Then and imagine that you have a forecasting platform. Maybe it's classified, maybe it's unclassified, whatever. Put the details of it aside. And that platform says that the probability is 75%. And then suppose you've got a super sharp intelligence analyst working on China, putting together a briefing for a high-level policymaker. They think that the crowd is totally wrong. They think the probability is 25%. I think that it would be useful in a showing your work kind of way and highlighting dissent kind of way, which the intelligence community is actually used to, if you think about things like red teaming, to have then a briefing that from that analyst to a policymaker include both the analyst's assessment, the crowd's assessment, and why the analyst thinks that they're right. It provides essentially a built-in form of red teaming and of flagging dissent in a way that I think could actually be really powerful in both helping analysts better explain their assessments and helping policymakers, see differences of opinion in a way that might help them in deciding what to do with the intelligence information that they get.
To make that happen, what do you need? Do you need a champion at ODNI somewhere else? Like, what is the practical hurdle from actually implementing the things that you propose?
I mean, I actually think the kinds of initiatives that we're talking about here, if you really wanted to do them within the U.S. government, I mean, you're talking about a couple $1 million a year at the end of the day, which is like a lot of money to me in the grand, but we're not talking about like buying an F-35 here from a policy, from a budget perspective. I think that you'd need a high level, some combination of a high-level bureaucratic champion or two with the ability to, in an office that had, some plausible responsibility for these kinds of issues, or like interest on the Hill to, think about putting these through a legislative process. I mean, I think there are a couple of different things, but at the end of the day, this kind of effort won't work unless you get bureaucratic buy-in, which is why I think, addressing some of the issues that you raised before, thinking about these sort of methods as a complement rather than a substitute for traditional analysis is much more likely to, which I think is both one, accurate, and two, more likely to lead to success. Because doesn't matter who your bureaucratic champion is, if they're a political appointee, eventually they're going to leave. And so for these kind of methods to succeed, you need bureaucratic buy-in. And I think that that's really possible. And I think that there are a lot of advantages. But the start, you need bureaucratic buy-in, but then you also need to actually persuade the relevant communities of interest that like this is actually something they should do.
Do you think the value proposition has been effectively communicated to the people you'd want to be the end users within the government? Or do you think there's still a communication challenge that needs to be overcome?
I think that there's a huge communication challenge I would say in two ways. Say one, as part of the efforts that we're doing at Perry Worldhouse on this, we're doing stakeholder interviews, talking to current and former government officials about how they think about forecasting and how they would want probabilistic forecasts communicated to them in ways that might make things, in ways that would make it useful for them. The challenge is that like nearly all the people we've talked to, frankly, weren't that aware of some of the pre-existing intelligence community initiatives in this arena. So there's certainly a communication challenge from that perspective, and that you had these I think really important scientific breakthroughs in thinking about geopolitical forecasting that not enough people fundamentally have known about. It's one of the reasons we were interested in writing the report in the first place. That's one communication challenge. Yeah. Second communication challenge is you could have the best forecasting platform in the world. One that if it told you there was a 75% chance that China would invade Taiwan, that actually meant a 75% chance. But if you can't package and present that information to analysts and then policymakers in a way that is useful for them, it doesn't matter.
Right.
And so I think actually one of the most important tasks, probably the most important task, if this kind of system is implemented, I mean, sure, we can push the science forward. There are definitely ways to push the science forward, but I think the communications task in designing an effective communications system would be the first order of business, because if people don't use it, it doesn't matter how good it is.
Yeah, you talk about one of the reasons that some of these programs have not been adopted is an example of the valley of death, where things can do very well on the S&T side, but have difficulty actually getting implemented. And one reason you suggest that could be the case is that during the S&T phase, people aren't focusing on the end users. One of the challenges I imagine for forecasting is that the possible end users aren't familiar with the tools, and so there isn't really an existing demand for these tools. How do we cater to the interests of the end users when they don't know how best to use the tools at this point in time?
Absolutely. I mean, that's why I think success, if success in an initial adoption probably involves sort of high-level bureaucratic champions, then I think success in use requires a combination of push and pull factors. It requires there being some senior policymakers, mid-level policymakers, any policymakers who think that these tools are important and interesting. And I do think that word has been getting out about some of these kinds of approaches, and that if a platform like this was created, that there be some inherent demand for it. And if there's a group of people that if you told them essentially that this existed again or now, that they would be excited to do it, excited to use it. So that's one side, is getting those early adopters excited about a tool, and maybe people that already have some pre-existing interest in questions of forecasting, or who might maybe have a more quantitative bent themselves, or a more probabilistic bent, et cetera. But then on the push side, I think if you can, by harnessing the interest of the bureaucracy essentially in being right, and in having this new tool that can help more accurately convey probabilities, that part of that is then pushing that out to those policymakers who maybe don't know that they need it until they see it, and then they wonder where it's been their whole life.
I'm gonna turn to some of the questions we're getting in the Q&A,
Sure.
and Mike, you should feel free to dive into these as well. First question is about the backgrounds of people who work at, say, the IC or any of these places where you think a platform might be useful. Some people are obviously more inclined to, or more open to quantitative methods than others. Should the IC or other agencies be trying to hire more from more number-friendly fields? Is that, I mean, this is not in the question, but my bias, should they be hiring fewer lawyers? I have a law background, so I like to make fun of throw lawyers under the bus because they don't like numbers.
I mean, I think if you look across the US government, there are plenty of people that like numbers that are hired into national security positions. I mean, also lots of lawyers, but there are plenty of people who are from those kinds of fields, especially if you think about what people sort of maybe like undergrad fields or MA fields were, that end up in the intelligence community. But I think this also gets to I think it's a good point. I also think it gets to the question of what education and training should look like. Since, you don't need to be able to, like write a statistical distribution yourself, or like run a statistic, or like be able to like program in Python or R or something to be able to understand, a 75% probability from a method that, is successful on these kinds of questions, at this rate. And that's just sort of generated that, in a particular way. But you need is actually a little bit of education and training on that kind of system. Now, obviously, if you have a background in probability, some sort of background in probability, like that's not going to hurt. But, I actually think that there's a lot of potential to, even take the lawyers with a bit of, training that it's not rocket science at the end of the day. It's about familiarity as much as anything, and in understanding the limits of these approaches as much as the upsides. But so I think that, certainly the IC could, I suspect could do a better job recruiting from more quantitative arenas, but honestly, I don't know enough about baseline IC recruitment to give you a definitive answer on that. Like, I suspect that they're actually like pretty okay at it already. If you think about like the NSA, for example, and what like recruitment and, sort of looks like. But I think education and training is actually like a really key part of how you would socialize and build support for this kind of system.
Another question is about the challenge of low forecaster engagement. Someone says this is a hurdle that they've faced. Do you have any ideas about how to improve engagement?
So I think it depends on what you mean. Part of this depends on what the goal of the system is. If the goal of the system is you've got a sort of underlying understanding, like, all right, what we really need is like 500 people forecasting kind of on this question. We've got a really big pool of potential forecasters. So actually people don't forecast all that often. But we're like getting above that, like 500, whatever we think the magic number is for, say, like a given like kind of question or something. And you could like build data on that over time and like tracking accuracy. Then low forecaster engagement from a generating aggregate probabilities that are useful, not as much of an issue. If the goal involves, training in cognitive debiasing or probability for forecasters, then low forecasting engagement would be a challenge.
Right.
So I think it depends on what the goals of the or if the goal, say, is identifying the best forecasters, over time, then low forecaster engagement again would sort of be a challenge, because it's not sort of apples to apples, like everybody's forecasting on the same number of questions or something like that. So I would say that low forecaster engagement is a barrier in some cases to goals, but not in others, depending on what the goal that you're talking about is.
Do you think forecasting could have helped predict something like the pandemic? And the broader question is, to what extent can forecasting be used on kind of black swan-like events where you don't have, a clear base rate to reference? The event might be the result of significant changes in the environment. Are those the kinds of things that forecasters are good at? Is the science there yet? Is that still an open question that warrants more research?
I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, if we're talking about like literally predicting black swans, then I hesitate to be like, oh yeah, you can predict unpredictable things. Because like that's a rough ask even for a really good forecasting system. I would say in terms of the pandemic specifically, there are a couple of things here. And one is, if you look at things like the US NIC kind of global trends like report, they did call out pandemic risk. There are multiple US government intelligence assessments that do call out pandemic risk as a thing to be worried about. So I think that from that perspective, we're not talking about a fail. In fact, we're talking about a success in a way, but in that task. But what those reports couldn't necessarily tell you is what the actual probability was. This gets to where being more explicit about probability maybe could be helpful. And couldn't tell you what change over time might look like. So say you were talking about pandemic risk, so then what would you want if we're talking about, say, like whether we're talking about a like machine learning approach, like aggregating, public source data, or like a crowd of forecasters with maybe an algorithm layered on top of it. You'd maybe want to ask a question about a pandemic that was always open. And, maybe the probability is normally at 1%. But if that probability then goes from like 1 to 5%, even though the probability is still really low, then that provides a signal then for analysts and others to dive in on that topic. So what I think quantitative, what I think probabilistic forecasting can buy you when it comes to low probability, high impact events, like what it buys you is early warning tracking on changes in the probability of very low probability, high impact events, that even if the probability is staying low, if it's doubled, tripled, quadrupled, according to a method that you think is actually relatively useful, then like that provides like it's like a warning flare to like go take a look in more detail. That might be what I think you could, where you've got a return on investment specifically with some of those really important low probability, high impact events.
Great. I like thinking of it as something like a stock ticker. It's quite useful when you want to know what effect a recent policy or bill will have on an industry. You can look at their stock price, and that reflects some guess about the effect. And if you see a little bump, like that's
right,
what the market thinks. It wouldn't be cool if we could look for little bumps in non-financial contexts.
Absolutely.
What types of explicit pushback or objections have you heard from policymakers or intelligence analysts? So presumably not just the things that you're guessing are obstacles, but why have people said this is not a good idea, this won't work?
I mean, I think that you have there are a couple of different types of objections to this kind of system. I think one is that numerical probabilities communicate too much, a false precision, sort of false confidence. That, if you say something is like, all right, like, why is it really 53% likely as opposed to like 55% likely? Like how is that even like plausible, essentially? And I'll be honest, like, that's not crazy. Like the question of, all right, is it 53, 54, 55? There's like maybe bigger deal academically in some ways than from a policy perspective. But I think that and this is, I think, where part of the education and training issue comes in. I think the lack of common understanding from, using phrases like it's likely, it's unlikely, it's somewhat likely, the way that lack of common understanding about probability can generate policymaking challenges, I think outweighs some of those risks of it looking like false precision, particularly because you can use education and training to give people a better understanding of what those probabilities mean. A second objection is actually related to that, which is that, like, all right, but if the probability shifts from like 53 to 55 or something, or 56, like, does that matter? And the answer is that changes in probability actually won't always matter, but like that's okay. And for different kinds of questions, it might matter differently. Say we're talking about the probability of a war between North Korea and South Korea. If that probability changed from, over a 6-month period from, 2% to 30%, like that actually might be a pretty big deal. That drive changes in troop deployments, in posture, sort of planning, et cetera, from a defense perspective. But if it goes from like 30 to 35, maybe not, because it might be that the next kind of like tipping point where you would actually change policy is maybe above 50% or sort of something like that. That essentially policy relevant probabilities are not going to be like there aren't going to be like 100 points of those along the probability continuum, because you could have issues where, like, all right, you might change your policy at 25%, at 50%, at 75%, and then as you approach 100% or something like that. But that doesn't mean it's not useful to know what the probability is and to know when you're crossing those barriers, crossing those Rubicons where you should be changing policy, because I think that stock ticker aspect, as you said, of these sorts of forecasting methods help you more explicitly and clearly see when you're at the point where you should be talking about potential policy change, depending on whatever probability level you think that, then we would make a change.
I know one of the platforms that was shut down, or projects, before it even really began, the DARPA's policy market, was branded as what was it? A betting parlor for terrorists or something,
for the risk of terrorist attacks.
Right. Is that a concern that you hear, that there's something kind of callous about quantifying certain risks?
I think that was a bigger concern in the years after 9/11 when there was a lot of sort of, I mean, I think there are two things. One is, and I think the accusation at the time was that people could make money off of a potential terrorist attack occurring or not occurring, and there could be foreign money involved. And so like, thus you were in like a prediction market that could have like actual policy, depending on how liquid the market was, how much money there is, et cetera, that there could be like real consequences to that. But like, that's pretty easily solvable. And how you sort of, think about, in how you sort of think about this. Like, I think that I think there was just a lot more sensitivity, or maybe not sensitivity. I think that the utility of these methods was a lot less socialized sort of out there in the world than it is today. But mostly, but honestly, mostly it was just the way that specific program allegedly was set up, according to like when you're reading, like I wasn't around, reading some commentaries at the time, was such, raised some like things that like I would think would be red flags today, but you can just avoid those by there's, if like a probability aggregation platform doesn't need to be like a prediction market with real money. Like those are different things.
Right. You discuss prediction markets versus polling platforms, and you seem to come down on the latter. The ICPM was the former, right? So do you know why the ICPM was a prediction market, and why do you think a polling platform is a better approach? Oh, Mike, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. I do not actually remember exactly why the ICPM. You'd need to ask somebody smarter than me about why exactly the ICPM was a prediction market. But I think part of that had to do with the fascination with prediction markets in particular at the time. And one of the things that and I think this was there's been commentary about this sort of out there in the world, that some of the work that say like the ACE program and IARPA and sort of others did was actually pit prediction markets against other pit different kinds of forecasting systems against each other in ways that demonstrated that these aggregation platforms were actually really powerful. But I think part of this also goes back to that participation question that you asked about before, that the more complicated a forecasting platform is, even if gamified like a prediction market, the harder it's going to be for people to participate if you're asking people to participate as a sort of low impact part of their job, as opposed to like the thing that they do all the time. Like traders are trading all the time. A platform where you're just entering probabilities, I think it's just easier to use for the average busy person than a prediction market, which makes it then easier to get more participation from the people that you want to participate. So I think that there are participation advantages to an aggregation platform. And there's some empirical evidence that, especially given some of the challenges in making prediction markets usefully liquid, that aggregation methods give you a better shot from the perspective of forecasting accuracy.
Right. Why do you focus only on internal platforms? Why not have a platform with broader public participation, including government participation? Is this for classification reasons? I know that's something you discuss a lot in the paper, how to whether to have a classified platform, a non-classified platform. So what is the role of the public in the ideal setup?
I think the public could have several roles here. I mean, and let me start by saying, I think the British are a bit of a role model here. The British Cosmic Bazaar program is a UK government, but unclassified forecasting aggregation platform, I believe, meaning that you can forecast on it if you need a UK government email address, but it's unclassified. And so that dramatically increases the probability, the ability of a lot of people to participate. It's like, one way you can do this is having a classified platform. Maybe, for example, there are some kinds of questions that you don't even want to reveal you're asking or something. Another way to do it is to have a government only, but unclassified platform to try to maximize participation. And I would actually say that like a lowly classified or unclassified government platform, to the extent it helps you loop in, encourage participation from, say, like State Department Foreign Service officers, deployed abroad, probably actually gives you like a lot more fidelity in terms of the pool and an insight on some questions. I think the Good Judgment Project within the ACE program demonstrated that there's a lot of value to crowdsourced forecasting even outside the government.
Mhm.
And so, if you were going to do something like this, you could, but frankly, these things don't need to be competitive. You could have a government-only forecasting platform operating next to a crowd, and over time, you would then learn things about when your outside the government crowd does better or worse versus when your government platform does better or worse, or when when your highly classified platform sort of does better or worse. That would be additional information over time. Because once you built the kind of underlying platform, I think the marginal cost would not be so substantial. So you could get that, you could do those things. It's plausible to do that essentially. So that would then give you the ability to compare when different kinds of audiences are going to help you get to more accurate forecasts, which then gives you a better shot at improving policymaking.
What do you think the interest would be in conditional forecasts, trying to get forecasts on the effect of policy decisions that are under consideration?
Absolutely. I think that conditional forecasts are a key path forward potentially, and that if once you persuaded a policymaker that hey, this system really can tell you if there's a 75% chance versus a 50% chance of this kind of incident happening in the world, the next logical question is, all right, well, how would my proposed policy intervention influence that probability? So I think that conditional probabilities are actually pretty important in this context because it's the logical next question that policymakers would ask if persuaded that these kinds of methods are useful. Which gets back to this point of these systems are useful insofar as policymakers are willing to use them. If what we're talking about is sort of a government adoption here, and so I think it's logical that conditional forecasts would be a path people are interested in.
So we should have a couple minutes left, and I want to give you a chance just to solve the whole problem here on the record. So you're the Secretary of Defense or something similar.
Oh God.
And whatever you're the emperor of the U.S. government, and your goal is to take actions now that in the next few years would take actions over the next few years that will most improve the state of decision making in the U.S. government in say 10 years. So durable. What do you do?
First thing I do is I encourage everyone to use the Foretell platform. I think that you would take, off the top of my head, I'm almost certainly wrong about this, to be clear. I think you would want a multifaceted approach where that at sort of all elements of the process. So from who you're recruiting to what training looks like in doing training and probability and cognitive debiasing, to creating the kinds of forecasting platforms that we were just talking about, sort of maybe classified, government only and unclassified, sort of publicly available. And in building up the track record for those platforms and maybe running them against things like machine learning algorithms and other sorts of things to building up a track record over time to help you understand what kinds of questions, different kinds of things are better at, while you're simultaneously incentivizing participation in training you're making it act, not just like you have to do this, making it actually in the people actually believe it's in the interest, their own interest, to engage with these probabilities because it will help them be better at assessing the world and will help the government be better at forecasting important geopolitical events or non-events. So I think it's the intersection essentially of platform, of education and training, of recruitment that helps you get to a point where over a several year period you've built something that complements existing methods and that people are comfortable using and that policymakers are asking for.
Wonderful. Mike, it's been a pleasure as always. Any parting words?
I think these methods are really important. And I think that there's a real opportunity here at a relatively low cost to improve the capacity of the US government to engage in geopolitical forecasting. And as I mentioned before, I think what the British are doing might be a bit of a role model in this context. And I'm actually cautiously optimistic that there's the ability to make progress on these issues. And and from my perspective, I'll say with my institutional hat on, at Perry Worldhouse, what's behind me here, we focus on bridging the gap between academia and the policy world in this kind of issue, where there's interest, where you're taking academic research and government research and using it to try to advance policymaking is what our kind of institution, what your kind of institution at CSET is all about.
Sounds great. Needless to say, I'm convinced. Really glad you're working on this problem. Thank you to everyone who joined us, and have a wonderful day.